Good evening. Welcome to Live from Prairie Lights. I'm Lindsay Park. Tonight I'm pleased to present Timothy Liu, who will read from his new book of poetry, Don't Go Back to Sleep. Publishers Weekly says, known since the 1990s for his harsh blend of gay eroticism and visionary fervor, Liu continues to pursue his high ambitions from Whitmanesque odes to American jeremiads. These lyrics chase and capture insatiable desire adrift in a sad and hostile world. Quote, with the heart's purloined hermeneutics locked inside a box, unquote. Timothy Liu was born in 1965 in San Jose, California, to immigrant parents from mainland China. He is the author of 9 books of poems, including Of Thee I Sing, selected by Publishers Weekly as a 2004 Book of the Year, Say Goodnight, a 1998 PEN Open Book Margins Award, and Vox Angelica, which won the 1992 Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award. He has also edited Word of Mouth, an anthology of gay American poetry. Translated into 10 languages, Liu's poems have appeared in Best American Poetry, Bomb, Grand Street, Kenyon Review, The Nation, New American Writing, Paris Review, Plowshares, Poetry, the Pushcart Prize, Virginia Quarterly Review, and the Yale Review. His journals and papers are archived in the Berg Collection at the New York Public Library. Liu is professor of English at William Paterson University in New Jersey and lives in New York City with his husband. We are very happy to have him here tonight. Please welcome Timothy Liu.
Love comes quietly, finally, drops about me, on me, in the old ways. What did I know? What did I know? Thinking myself able to go alone all the way. There is the sign of the flower. But what or where to recover what is not love too simply? I saw her, and behind her there were flowers, and behind them nothing. So those are by the late Robert Creeley. And I'm thinking about Creeley tonight because my friend Stuart James is in the house. And we met over 25 years ago in grad school in the days before internet, social networking. And we've stayed in touch. And he went to the Great Mother Conference maybe 3 decades ago. And Creeley was there. We were talking about that earlier today. And I've just come back from the conference that Blythe started 40 years ago. It's still meeting now in Maine, and I've spent the last 9 days being cooked in this alchemical cauldron that didn't crack, and so I'm still kind of swimming my way out of it, and so I'm really glad to be here with you tonight. The temple bell stops. The temple bell stops ringing. But the sound keeps coming out of the flowers. The gift. When his hands were on the wet clay, turning on the wheel. When his hands were on the wet clay, turning on the wheel, I did not ask what he was shaping. I didn't ask what he was shaping, whether it was for flowers or for wine. It was only after he took his hands off and fired what he made in the kiln that I knew what I was without him. A bed of ash still warm to touch. I scavenge it for chunks of charred wood to be used as quick coals to get the next fire going. Some people hit the bottle. I turn off my phone to intensify the pain. Convince myself that when I power back on, there won't be any messages. My mother died twice. Once when her body was burned, and once again when her phone was disconnected. Me calling just to hear a voice say, "The number you dialed is not in service." The man who left my bed this morning has not returned my calls. And if I bury my phone in the woods out back, before he left, he asked if I ever felt lonely here. And I said, of course not. I'm a writer. So Stuart has brought his lovely wife, Ithaskun, and not their lovely children. At the Great Mother Conference last year, there were children in the back row kind of making a ruckus during one of the readings. And, I remember a couple of people were getting kind of agitated, and it's such a beautiful moment. The reader in front just said, oh no, that's the next generation. The next generation belong in this room. And I just thought, wow, it's amazing. It's very different from a story I heard about George Oppen giving a reading. He was giving a reading, and there was a baby crying in the back row. This is at San Francisco State. And he just stopped his reading, and he just said in despair, "I can't compete with that." And that was it. He walked off the stage. This is a long poem. It's called A Requiem for the Homeless Spirits, and there are little breaks in it, so that I'll signal with the bell. There is no language to adequately describe the Japanese crimes. Ma Ji-yu, survivor. Head of a Chinese soldier with a cigarette butt in its mouth. Taken by whom? Given by whom? Who never got to see the image he'd become in the papers, in textbooks, online. An image that has outlasted whatever grave he did or did not get to have in this life. This is not how anyone would want to be remembered. Future generations thumbing through the pages, the files, printing them out on desktop printers, printing off the same screens they used to check email, surf porn. The winner of this contest will get his photo on the front page of the paper. The heads of Chinese men taken off with one stroke of a broadsword, left nameless as a pile of rocks. Nameless as a headless corpse with hands bound behind its back, only the names of the winners on the front page of the Nichi Nichi Shimbun on December 13, 1937, in a language I cannot read, garlanding the photo of the smiling winners in uniform each propped up on his own sword, an image someone else who knows the language will have to explain to me. And my hairstylist, Akira, reads to me, contest to kill first 100 Chinese with sword extended. When both fighters exceed mark. Mukai scores 106 and Noda 105. Soon sleep will be taken away, appetite taken away, as that which clutches Akiro's throat starts to spread. A cloud that began from just 2 cigarettes a day, no insurance for the $800 price tag attached to each procedure, which may or may not save his life. He who has already lost half of his voice, refusing radiation, for fear of losing what remains, still recognizable as he takes a razor to my scalp, sculpting something that will last 4 weeks at best. He who's been doing this for more than half his life, who tells me he can still eat, still sleep 8 hours a night, while handing me a card for the next visit, a date that suddenly seems further away than ever. In a speech made in Nanjing 7 years after the rape of Nanjing, Emperor Hirohito's youngest brother, Prince Mikasa, detailed the extent of the military atrocities against the Chinese. Copies of his statement suppressed, buried by the military authorities. A single copy exhumed 5 decades later in the parliamentary library by a Kobe University professor. Order number 119, Western Front Battle Operations, 16th Division, 20th Regiment, 1st Battalion, November 16, 1937. All provisions to be levied locally in Nanjing, meaning rape, loot, pillage, destroy. And what? What do American textbooks say about First Nation genocide beyond all those blankets laced with the pox? And what will American textbooks say about Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, waterboarding, and extraordinary rendition 50 years from now, when history, as we all know, is written by the winners? This is not how anyone would want to be remembered. Reverend John G. Maggie, chairman of the International Red Cross Council, racing through gunfire to rescue disarmed Chinese soldiers being led off to the slaughter. Reverend John G. Maggie, an amateur photographer who obtained a permit from the Japanese authorities. The stills from his 16-millimeter movie camera largely responsible for what we're able now to see. His camera and film deposited at Yale, where he became a chaplain after the war. Photos exist. Some were rounded up with barbed wire in groups of 10 and herded down by the river where the machine guns were waiting. Some were forced to dig ditches, forced again to lie down in them, while the next group shoveled dirt on top of them, muffling their cries. Others buried up to their necks, only to be beheaded, bayoneted, flattened by the treads of a tank. Some were burned alive, gasoline igniting communal pits. Photos exist. Bayonet wounds on the back of a woman's neck, severing muscles down to the vertebral column. Some 80,000 women ages 8 to 80 raped, some of them stripped with their legs tied to a chair, some passing out, others bleeding to death, still others gang raped week after week until they contracted venereal diseases and were taken out back to be shot. objects inserted into the vaginas of corpses before they were posed for photographs. The souvenir film sent by Japanese soldiers to be developed in Shanghai, where extra prints were sometimes smuggled out to news agencies across the ocean. Memo to the 66th Regiment, 1st Battalion, December 13, 1937. Kill all captives. Few of the survivors remain alive. Few of the perpetrators remain alive. Some of their stories have been recorded. Many of their stories will never get told. What should any of us do while they are still alive? Akiro says textbook revisions exist. Japan's aggression against northern China replaced with Japan's advance into northern China. Japan's invasion of Southeast Asia replaced with Japan's advance into Southeast Asia. Please discuss. Mukai scores 106 and Noda 105. The newspaper article, "A Fabrication, a Complete Fiction," Mukai's attorney said before the War Crimes Tribunal. Propaganda that made for an enticing story for the two instantly famous lieutenants to seek out new brides. And when the Japanese police showed up at Mukai's door in the spring of 1947, Mukai said, "I did nothing wrong," telling his wife that the killing contest was all made up. "Oh, then, you lied to me," his wife reportedly said. Baskets of gold, baskets of jade. How can we trust the testimony of survivors not to be exaggerated? Baskets of gold, baskets of jade, all of it left behind, my mother said. When the Japanese marched toward the gates of Nanjing, my mother, born in 1936 according to the lunar calendar, never quite sure which date to officially use on her California driver's license. My mother's family, who went from everything to nothing, baskets of jade, baskets of gold, hauled off by the soldiers overnight. But something's not quite right, my father says, about the time and the place. She was born in Xi'an, not Nanjing. She wasn't even there when the soldiers scaled the walls after dropping ordnance sun up to sundown for weeks on end. Something must be wrong with her medication. Though it's true, my father says, her family ran from the Japs. We all did, just not in 1937. You know how she gets everything confused. Baskets of jade, baskets of gold. My mother, in and out of psych wards for the last decades of her life, dead at the age of 62, half a globe and more than half a century away from where she started. No way to verify exactly what she meant when she pulled a long gold hair from her own scalp and said, "You know, you must be at least an eighth German. There are so many things your father still doesn't know." Canceling class, I stay home from school, order 3 DVDs online, and surf the web all day for atrocities. Bullet, horse urine injected into human kidneys. Bullet, animal blood injected into veins. Bullet, Seawater injected into veins. Bullet, air injected into veins. Bullet. Bubonic plague injected into veins. Bullet. Limbs amputated, then reattached to opposite sides of the body. Bullet. Flamethrower practice. Bullet. Vivisection without anesthesia. Bullet. Limbs frozen off till only a torso and head remained, still breathing, eyes open. When my brother brought his girlfriend home for the first time, he thought her being Asian and a member of the college speech team would be enough. But when my parents heard her last name had a few syllables too many, Horiuchi, Yamaguchi, whatever it was, what could they do but frown and whisper to one another, "She's Japanese, so vicious." My family no longer knowing which country each of us were living in. Canceling class, I stay home from school, trying to square the accounts of just how many were massacred. 300,000? 200,000? 50,000? 50? Very little remains of the first grade. Only Sherry on a jungle gym at recess chanting, "Millimated monkey meat, roasty toasty parakeet, wormy vomit flowing down the avenue. Now it's time for lunch. I forgot my spoon." That and one other. Chinese, Japanese, Hercules, look at these. As Sherry rocked back and forth, bodacious knees churning inside an oversized tea. Never asked her why she pulled the outer corner of her eyes up for Chinese and down for Japanese. Quite sure now even she didn't know how such pieces of rote performance art got handed down at recess. The source of their origins unknown, at least to us, in 1971. And before they knew it, they found themselves beyond what they thought they were capable of. Bayoneted survivors who felt they had no choice but to bring their trophies home. Japanese heads impaled on long bamboo poles. Little else remains for my sophomore year in college but a course in abnormal psych. And little remains of that except for a lecture the professor gave about a serial killer who used to roam the Timpanogos Mountains on the very trails we were likely to hike as soon as school got out. Said the thing the killer liked to do most after binding his victims' wrists and ankles with duct tape was to turn on a portable cassette recorder while he chose one of many possible blades from a Swiss Army knife his mother had given him. Curious how the wounds he inflicted would each produce a different sound as the blade went in, then out, in, out. He who'd make an archive of his research, documenting the difference between puncturing a kidney versus a liver, an eyelid instead of a spleen, and the relish our professor took imitating some of the screams he'd heard, began to trump the facts themselves. He who had become the very thing he knew so much about, and in so doing made the lesson all the more memorable, indelible. Inscription on the tombstone of the homeless spirits. In October of 1938, I, Gao Guan Wu, was instructed by the government to go to Nanjing. It was a year after the Nanjing incident. Remains, however, still could be found on the mountains at the city walls in the thick growth of grass along the rivers. I myself collected 2,600 remains in the city and buried them. 2 months later, the villagers related to me that there were more abandoned remains at Mao Shan, Ma Quan, Ma An, and Linggu Monastery. The villagers pleaded for burial of those remains. Therefore, I conveyed this matter to the Public Health Bureau. As a result, more than 3,000 bodies were collected and buried at the Linggu Monastery. This monument was erected to guard against wild beasts and to memorialize those homeless spirits. This text is from a rubbing. The stone is now lost. The remains. Walking out of the new cemetery, my father takes my hand. It is Father's Day, right? This is my little Father's Day poem. Walking out of the new cemetery, my father takes my hand, having just reinterred the remains of his own father and his father's 2 wives. His mother dead from TB by the time he was 10. He takes my hand and says, "Now I can die in peace, even if we didn't get the actual bones." Village thugs hired by my uncle made sure the burial mounds behind the house my father grew up in would not feel a single shovel blade go in as they stood there sentinel with arms crossed. My uncle's wife had a dream that out of the grave's opened gash, demons rushed, ancestral ghosts not wanting to be disturbed. In less than a decade, bulldozers will come to take the Liu village down. My grandfather's ashes, my grandmother's bones, my own father walking away with 2 fistfuls of dirt and saying, "This will have to do. So many others have died who left nothing behind. I'll never come back to this place." My father kisses my hand, I who've flown across 12 time zones to be here, at his side in a borrowed van. Me looking out the window at a countryside once overrun with Japs marching west along the railroad tracks. My father and his siblings hiding in an outhouse, a dead horse found in the schoolyard soon after the soldiers had gone. "Your hands are so soft," I say to my father. "So are yours," he says. "Remember when it was we last held hands?" I must have been a kid, I say, maybe 8 or 10. "You were 6, my father says. "And I'm still your son," I say, leaning into his shoulder, our hands the same size. I'll always be your father, my father says, before I have the chance to say another word, my 86-year-old father nodding off into sleep. I want to share a few poems from this book that just came out. Coleman Barks translated the writings of Shams, which have not been, it's called The Sayings of Shams Tabriz, and it's in this book called Soul Fury. And Stuart, you were actually the first person to introduce me to Rumi in 1989. You gave me the book Open Secret, which Coleman translated. And what's interesting is these writings have only been collected in the last 10 years, and they've only been made available in English in the last year. So we've waited now almost 800 years for these writings. And what these are is Rumi and Shams basically had 3 good years sort of hanging out together. And a lot of the people who were with them wrote down what they said, and they're just exist in fragments, and they're just collected in all these weird different places, shoved away here and there. And so they really had to be ferreted out and reassembled. And so Coleman Barks was at the Great Mother Conference last week, and I'd never heard these, and they just really, they're quite something. So here's a few from the sayings of Shams. This is number 7. I am unable to know Rumi because his words are like a blindfold. I cannot see through them to his eyes and know who he is. His poetry is like that, a great joke, really. Hilarious, a mask, a new kind of conjuring. Let me say this clearly. Hypocrisy makes you ecstatic, drunken with the presence you feel. Truth makes you sad, discouraged, empty. I said recently to one man, "You are just amazing. There is no one like you in this generation." He took my hand. I have misjudged you. You see, last year I was not complimentary, and he became my enemy. It's very odd. To live congenially with others, you must be something you are not. Live then hypocritically if you want to get along with others. When you start to tell what is really in your heart, you have to go to the mountains or to a desert. There is no way to stay in community if you try to stay. There's no way to stay in community if you try to say the truth. So we have a different spirit here. And, I've always been fascinated about Shams, and it's just so embodied. I told Rumi that my first requirement in this friendship with him was that I should act with him the same as I would if I were alone. For example, when I am alone, I pee, I take a shit. The body is a way to get around. A mount, a horse. It eats fodder, it breaks wind, it pees. You say all this does not matter. I say it does. This is slightly longer. This is the last passage I'm going to read from the Shams. This is number 18. There are many deep souls that I love internally without showing it. I sometimes don't let such love be known. It is there, but it does not take form. Once or twice I have made it manifest by doing something while I was with them, but they did not recognize the friendship I was offering, nor did they accept their obligations in such companionship. Is that beautiful? They did not recognize the friendship I was offering, nor did they accept their obligations in such companionship. I do not allow their disregard to make my love for them grow cold. On the other hand, when I let my love for Rumi open toward him, the friendship always became greater, never less. I cannot tell all the truth I know. If I did, if I said that all at once, this whole city would throw me out. Even the very young, and certainly the very old. Rumi himself would join in to exile me. Would you like to know why? Would you? Because when he saw such extreme behavior, he would feel he had to join in to help them realize the error of such excess. Then, in the midst of that, he would see that I was going a different way, and he would turn and follow me. I just close with two poems for a beloved not far from here. We stand in line for a pack of cigs. My man who lets me drag off his rather than giving me my own. Some say he's never slept with another man. Driving home, my hand rests on his when he's done shifting. As we listen to someone croon, "It was the first time, and you knew you would." And his SUV turns into a boat of flowers, nosing into waves of wheat just off the interstate. $45 a night motel rooms, inviting us to stop, pretending there isn't a whole lot more going on. All I know is I miss him. I miss him all the time when we're not bathed in dashboard light. Everything I could want right there. A man I know I could leave my husband for. The ring on my finger, a shackle, a trifle. No road long enough for where we're headed. The bridegroom. He said, "You talk too much." He said, fucking his wife was like doing the Stations of the Cross over and over, always in the exact same way. He told me to saddle up my ponies, told me to go easy there, hoss. His voice a blindfold around my head. I did exactly what he said. He liked my thick hair, liked squeezing my mouth slowly open with finger and thumb, prying down my lower lip before gently grazing there. Soon after, he stopped saying anything. His hand holding up the backside of my head, cradling it like a newborn calf, his hardness riding against my loins, crushing my sex, the bruises only showing later as proof of his sudden visitation. Late afternoon sun starting to dip below the ridge, the sky itself turning from champagne to cinnamon, his body all vice and torque as he took me in his arms, bride and chattel, his tongue a branding iron that took its time, burning the moment into me, a wetness already purling there. His eyes scratching out the prayers I knew by heart, I who knew there'd likely be nothing left when he got through. So I think we're supposed to attempt a Q&A. You know how these things go. We have like 10 minutes. Is there anything you want to know? Or anything you want to share?
I'll start.
Okay.
Something. The rape of Nanking, was that something that was present in your family all your life, or was that something that you learned about later and wrote about it? Or
The effect of the war was always present, but it wasn't until I read Iris Chang's book, The Rape of Nanjing, that I understood anything about its history. But you know how these things go. In our families, there are these events, and there's a kind of family history that gets whispered, and it becomes a part of you. And so later on, you actually read books about it to sort of fill in, you know, the things that there's no way you could have understood when you were growing up. Yeah.
more questions or comments for Tim? If not,
Nick Twemlow.
Hello, that was great. I just wonder if you could talk about the long poem in terms of, personal, and then the sort of, not impersonal, but the stuff beyond. Like, I just think about how you think about the relationship, how long it took. These are mechanical questions, but it's a long poem, and it moves around in lots of spaces. It has a narrative mode. It has a deeply, feels like confession, or even personal mode. I just wonder if you could talk more about how it came to be. And I'm also curious about your family in terms of reading your books and how they respond.
Let me start with the tail end there. This book I haven't given my family. And the other books I've written, some I've given years after they've appeared. And I'm not sure, I mean, my mother has been dead 17 years. And my father is now 86, and I just visited him. And I didn't give him the book. I don't know why. I mean, I almost want to just tear the last page out and give him that. Right? There's just too much cock and semen in this book. You know, and he's such a fundamentalist Christian. I think he would find that. Although he's read my other books, so I don't know. So this is an odd question. When I read in California a few weeks ago, I didn't invite any of my family members to the reading. They all have heard me read once, and I think that's enough. I just want them to, hear me read once. This is what I do, and that's it. So I don't know how you guys feel about that. I'm just talking about family, the nuclear family and your children, right? And for me, I feel more comfortable when my brothers, when my father, and my nieces are not at the reading. Okay? When my mother died, I stopped listening to music for 6 months. And there's a poem in this book about that. And to not torture any more questions, I might just read that after I answer this. And then when my cat died, 10 years later, my cat Colette, I actually grieved harder for the cat. Now, and I don't know if you guys feel this way. And even at the Great Mother Conference in a men's group, which was confidential, so I'm doing border crossing a little bit, but I think the confidentiality is not attaching names to the stories. Some people have talked about how when their dog died, it broke something open in them in grief that they couldn't access when a parent died. Okay, so I'm just offering that out there. So when my cat died and I cried every day hard for 5.5 months, I did feel a little guilty, and I thought, gosh, I didn't feel this way about my mother. And so I stopped listening to music then, and I also stopped writing poetry. And so when I resumed the writing part, I decided to write a novel. And during that time, I worked on one poem, and that was the long poem. So I felt that somehow this grief that my cat gave me access to, of course, made me think about my mother and the real grief that I had about her. And then I thought about, well, what made this woman so crazy and so, terrifying and traumatic and awful in my life? I mean, she was, I was really glad when she died. She was 62, very young. It was like a great relief. And I was sad, but I was more relieved than sad. I just wanted her out of my life. And so with the 10-year sort of window, I had a little bit more compassion for her, thinking, well, what made her crazy? And so I knew in the background the story, which is not in the poem, that her father died of a heart attack when he was 40 during the war. And then my mother was the youngest daughter of 6 children, and she was just passed around from sister to sister for much of her growing up. And the story my dad used to tell me is when she was 12, she would just be out in the backyard mud having her meals with the ducks because she felt more comfortable with ducks than with other children. And so none of that's in this poem, but it made me want to find out a little bit more about how a piece of history that both my mother and father had lived through, how that filtered down into suburban California in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, and the 80s, right? Because I never understood why they were so upset with Japanese people. None of their friends were Japanese. And when my brother brought home a Japanese girlfriend, I mean, they about shit a brick. It was not okay. And which was very, that we all look the same. I mean, some of you out there, I can tell the difference. There's actually a website that you can take a quiz. I wish I could remember the name of it. They show you faces and you're like, oh, Korean, Hawaiian, try it. You can get concrete about this. So the thing is about this poem is the history's already being written. Okay, so you can't, your poem can't be a regurg of history because we have historians to do that work. And so the poem has to be lyrically collaged with something else, right? So in a history, you're not going to bring in your little dumb family story. And so that's what I thought was an occasion to sort of use these two stories together to sort of create a space. And the poem, the first draft of it took a year. It was twice as long as what ended up in the book. So I had to get rid of a lot of it. It didn't matter for the poem. And so I did feel that this poem, it made me understand something about trauma that comes to all of our front doors. So I think all of us are really affected very deeply by the wars in the countries that we've lived in. That's what I really think. And so this was just my little chance to sort of take a look at that and sort of see what that story had to say back. And of course, my mother, had been dead 10 years when I wrote this, but I did write this as a memorial for her. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but at least it's a way of talking a little bit about it. If there's not another burning question, I can just entertain you. Subdue. Sure. So this is, I'll end with this. There's a lot of stuff in poems that we don't say that probably would have been good putting into the poem, but it's too late. And I'll just say that my mother, when she died of pancreatic cancer, so it was really fast. It was a 3-week window. And her last words, and I wasn't there. I was there 6 days before she died. I spent the whole day with her, and I was the one who was appointed to tell her that she was dying. But she died after I left, and she said her last words to my brother, my older brother, and my father was in the room. And the odd thing is she said them to my brother, who doesn't remember the words, but my father heard and told me because I really wanted to know. And she turned to my brother, and I guess she wasn't really addressing him. She was just kind of addressing the air. And she just said, love your children, music, poetry. And my dad wanted me to know. Because she failed us in a lot of ways, but she tried to give us her love of music and her love of poetry. So I wrote this for her. This is classical music. On the day my mother died, I unplugged the stereo. At a time when record clubs still sent out their selections of the month, unless you said otherwise. The mail piled up on a table in the entry hall, an avalanche of bills and condolences I knew I didn't have to respond to. People would understand. My cat stopped sitting on the amplifier, found other sources of heat to get through a winter punctured by the clang and hiss of radiators built before my mother was born. Feeding the cat, changing the litter, done without music in the house. Months later, I took myself to a live concert, something by Mozart, something I remember first having heard in the back of a '68 Rambler, the radio on, my mother and father trying to guess the name of the composer, the one game I knew my mother would win. It comes to that. One moment you're turning a dial lit up on the dash, and the next you're not.